Hello, friends, and welcome to Binge O'Clock, the podcast where we watch something and then we talk about it. I'm Joy Selden, and I've seen almost everything.
I'm Ziyanga, and I've seen almost nothing.
I'm Nella, and doomed polar exploration is something that can be actually so personal.
Is this like
Surprise!
Is this like horse girl? Like, you know you're a horse girl when?
You know you're into doomed polar exploration when? Yes, it is.
A wild Nella has appeared.
It's me. I'm back.
It is. It's Nella. It's the return of the Nella. So, yes, friends, we are going to be talking about The Terror Season 1, as we mentioned in our Gallivant wrap-up. The Terror is a little bit of a special case. It's sort of more like an American Horror Story, where the seasons don't necessarily have to be watched even in order or, one after the other, because they take historical events and put a, fictionalized horror spin on them. And Terror Season 1 is about the doomed Franklin expedition, and mostly based on a book written by the same name.
Pretty staunchly based on a book by the same name, and I will get into that. But meanwhile, the second season deals with Japanese internment camps. So I remember when they went into season 2, people just didn't understand how we went from Franklin to internment camps. Like, it seems like the audience didn't get the memo of like, okay, but we're making it like a horror anthology and each season's going to be something different. So to my recollection, season 2 did not do well. They did not renew it. I see that there's talks about possibly bringing back a season 3, which I personally think would be really great. But just for this stretch of the pod, we're going to focus on that season 1, since it is a 10-episode singular story that does wrap up.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good thing to cover. For if you're new to the podcast, which, welcome.
Welcome.
We're going to be doing things a little bit differently for this season. This episode is going to be a historical context for the thing we're about to watch, because these were real people and really honestly terrible things happen to them in, reality, as opposed to the horrors that we're going to actually see on the show. And we'd just like to have some of the historical context before we go into that, because, once we get into the fictionalized version of it, that's going to be the driving force, character development, what the big bad is, etc., etc.
And that's why I'm here.
And that's why Nella's here, because Nella is our resident. Oh, are we talking about a doomed polar expedition? Sign me up. So, here.
So what's really the one thing that is continuing through this season of Bach Pod is that Joy and I will continue not to look things up.
Yes.
Now we don't have to.
We have a Nella for that.
Yes. And I take this job very seriously. Probably too seriously.
No such thing.
I'm also so excited to share this doomed expedition with everyone. I just, we were joking about some people are horse girls when they're younger. To me, it's strange when I find out other people didn't have a high school / college period where they got really into doomed polar expeditions. That doesn't compute for me. And I understand the real crime biddies who are just like, oh my God, yeah, I was obsessive about serial killers. I get that, because it's not serial killers for me. It's many ways white people have died trying to find things that were already found by other people, but we didn't know about them.
But I had to be the first.
I have a very,
and we were not,
very special place in my heart for those kind of things.
for the dumb white men of the past. Let's see how.
Not even dumb white men, but it's just
as
white men
we'll find
out of their comfort zone, out of their league.
We'll find out, there are some very, very intelligent men on this expedition that happen to go on this expedition.
Men of experience too. These were not greenhorns. These were also men who had done their time in the Royal Navy, had served Queen and country, and all ended up dead. So,
yep.
Yeah, spoilers.
There are different kinds of smart and different ways to be intelligent, and, Yeah.
And sometimes nature just wants to kill you, know? And there's no experience you can possibly bring to the table that can save you from that sometimes.
Yeah.
That's just how it is. Sometimes nature just wants you dead. Because nature doesn't want you dead. Nature just exists.
Exactly. And I look at the polar expeditions like we look at space, of just like space is trying in so many ways to kill you all the time, every day, every minute. Like, yes, the polar.
And like sometimes once in a blue moon, you get to grow potatoes and poop. But most of the time,
it's just trying to kill you.
You just die.
So sorry, we're already 7 minutes in, but basically, if you're just joining us for the first time, we're going to talk about these episodes. We're going to watch one episode at a time, so it'll be about 10 episodes of the podcast. That may change, but that's what we're working on right now. And then we'll have a wrap up at the end. Nella and I have seen season 1. Danielle has not, as is her
classic.
Very you way to be on brand. And so I think we can pretty much just turn it over to Nella. And Danielle and I have promised to try and keep our questions to a minimum while she runs through most of it. I can't guarantee we won't react.
Of notes, and that's just for the introduction.
I know.
So Joy reminded me, we're recording this Monday, right? And you just need to do introduction. And then I looked at my notes document. That was many more pages of excruciating detail. And then I panicked. But I think I brought it to Rain. I can say that researching this topic, again, made me realize how much not everybody like me knows about the Franklin expedition. Because I'd be meeting up with friends and they would be like, so what you been up to, Nella? And I'd be like, researching the Franklin expedition for a podcast just because. And then every time those friends would be like, the Franklin expedition, what's that? Like, shocking to me. But I was really taking it for granted that not everyone goes through this very specific doomed polar exploration phase like I did. While I am sure there are going to be listeners that are aware of the Franklin expedition and what we know and what we don't know about it, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of other people, just like those friends of mine, or even just one friend of mine who I made watch the show with me, and she really enjoyed it, but I made her watch it, and then she was like, wait a minute, are you telling me this is the Franklin that Stan Rogers song has that line about? And I was like, yes, the Northwest Passage line. This is that Franklin. This is that hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea.
I believe I had the exact same reaction. And it wasn't until we had watched the entire season and then I was like, wait a minute.
Yes.
It took the whole season.
So I am sitting here and I want to try and curb my enthusiasm just a little bit because I don't want to overwhelm everybody, even though I am like vibrating with excitement to be sharing this with you. So my goal for right now is I'm going to use this episode to set up the history of polar exploration by the British, what the Franklin expedition was and what they hoped to accomplish. And then as we watch each episode, I will try to share historically relevant details specific to the episode that may offer additional context, and then maybe offer some compare and contrast to what the book did that the show is based on. So, but right at the top, yes, this was a fictionalized book written by sci-fi and horror author Dan Simmons. It was published in 2007, and it is a fictionalized account of what happened to Sir John Franklin's lost expedition on the ships HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror in the years of 1845 to 1848. Now, the show was developed by David Kujanik and Sue Hugh, who they both served as co-showrunners. Ridley Scott was a producer. It premiered in March 2018. And what's interesting is David Kujanik had actually been obsessed with this project since the beginning. He was beaten to acquiring the rights to the novel by Universal, but he was then hired to do the script for a feature version of the book. And he stayed involved through all those years until finally the studio dropped the project, and AMC, who was looking for a way to beef up its horror reputation after the success of The Walking Dead, they snatched it up as an option and decided to do a miniseries instead of a movie.
Gosh, I can't imagine this as a movie.
It's too much.
That is
too much. It
too
needs
much.
the air to breathe.
I mean, I haven't even seen it, but I'm like, how do you take something that's 10 episodes long and delete 80% of it?
Yeah, like you need so much context for it all by itself, which is like we are trying to provide the context to our listeners, but you would need continue. My brain is like, what would you eat? How would you even?
Yeah, no, the answer is you wouldn't and you can't, and thank God they didn't.
Yes, and they didn't.
And they didn't. Just as a little interesting side note, the co-creator Sue Hugh is currently the showrunner and executive producer of Apple TV Plus's series Pinchenko. And also, supposedly, she is in work of optioning the book Wisconsin Death Trip, which is a non-fiction sort of, it's hard to explain, but it's like a cult hit where it was like this guy was doing his doctorate on like history stuff, and then he kept finding all these really kind of gnarly stories from like the 1880s from Wisconsin of like crimes and murders and deaths and kind of weird, unsettling events that were happening in the West. And he compiled them along with a bunch of photos. And it has, like, Neil Gaiman writes about how, like, this was really influential for me. It sort of got me into this brain space for American gods, for example.
Interesting.
So I find it really cool that this other co-runner is, like, seems to be really into, like, meaty horror stuff, but also, like, historical, like, taking historical events that either have an element of horror to them or even just, like, really trying to unpack historical wrongs, for example.
Right.
Especially when looking at her role in the series Pinchenko. So that's how it came to be. And when I first watched it, I was desperate for a Craig Manson style podcast to accompany it. And Craig Manson is the showrunner of The Last of Us and of Chernobyl. You know, every show he's done a podcast tie-in.
And it's been amazing. Like, highly recommend.
God, what a gift.
For anyone for the 4 people who haven't watched Last of Us, highly recommend you also listen to the companion podcast. It elevates the show on a level and Chernobyl also has a companion podcast. Highly recommend.
What amazing gifts in 2 different ways, because the Chernobyl one in particular, you know, they really want to unpack the history and why they made the story choices they did that might, you know, counter what the actual history was, but how it illuminates another point they were trying to make. And then meanwhile, The Last of Us is just a wonderful breakdown of like adapting a video game to a TV series and how that works. But again, watching The Terror, I was desperate for something like that because I could sense how meaty it was and how much work they had put into it, which is hilarious because there was the Wrapped article about how the AMC's The Terror showrunners really, really want you to fact check them seriously. And David and Sue go on and on about how this show is built for people who are looking for historical Easter eggs and who, if something interests you, look it up. Because
that's awesome.
we were very, very interested in the real life history and of the artifacts that were found and everything that tied into it. So please, like, if you think there's a bigger story to something you see in the background, there probably is, and look it up. So challenge accepted.
I can't wait for that to come up during our podcast episodes.
Yeah.
And this is why we have Nella.
Yes. So again, I'm ready to sink my teeth into this. But first I think we need to, because this is going to come up and there's just a few things I want to sort of differentiate up from the get-go. First off, the difference between Arctic and Antarctic, because in British history, we're exploring both at the same time. According to NASA, now, just in case you weren't aware of this, the Arctic is an ocean, and it is covered by a thin layer of perennial sea ice and is surrounded by land. And that sea ice will ebb and flow and grow and shrink depending on the season, depending how bad the winter is, or, you know, now in climate change, we're losing it really rapidly. But there's no landmass in the center there, unlike Antarctica, which is a continent, which is covered by a thick ice cap.
These are things I did not know.
Yes, now you know. Huh. Now you know. Yeah, it's just a big Arctic Ocean up there. It just happens to be covered in ice.
Well, that makes a lot of sense now. That's why but now I'm just sitting here like, of course you were trying to like, this is why you went on the expedition to go through the Arctic, to not like reach the Arctic, right? Because it's like, there's technically not, like, you just need to find the avenue to get through it.
Yeah. And now, mind you, people were, you know, there were also expeditions later on in the 1900s to find the North Pole.
Sure.
For example, because, you know, everyone wants to find magnetic north and true north. It's that understanding of you can see the water around it and you can see how the ice ebbs and flows and people just really hoping they could find a way through it. And like I said, on the other hand, the Antarctica is an actual landmass. There is, every once in a while, I see this going around about how, oh, do you know Arctic is just Greek for bear, and Antarctic just means not bear? So it's like the Arctic is where the bears live, and the Antarctic is where the bears don't live. That's not quite what it is. There is a theory, and we do know that the Greeks like got up to like the Shetland Islands and like poked around Arctic waters,
Right.
and we think it comes from the Greek word for bear in regards to they were referring to the constellation of Ursa Major or Ursa Minor.
I would believe that way sooner than the other hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, polar bears do live in the Arctic. It just sounds a bit too convenient.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, like Antarcticos, which just means the opposite of the Arctic. So it's more, it's, and also I couldn't really find a timestamp on, but when did we name it the Antarctica? Like, when did that happen? So, when you see that going around of like, oh, it means that's where the bears are, just take it with a little grain of salt. Because I looked and it's not quite that.
No, thank you for that, because that is 100% one of those memes that I would be like, really? And probably not look into it very much, very close.
But meanwhile, so, hey, the Arctic, it's there, it's a place. And like all that land surrounding it, we know people have been exploring the Arctic region in the north for thousands of years. Well after indigenous people, the Greeks show up and be like poking around, looking, and then the ice got to them and they ran back.
It got too cold for the Greeks and they went,
it got
nope.
too cold. Yeah, and then, the Norse take a gander around that area in the 10th century.
Oh, I 100% believe the Vikings were just like, this looks perfect. And then they were like, we're going to get stuck here. Let's reverse.
That's where we get the whole thing of Greenland versus Iceland, where Iceland is where you can live and Greenland is much more Arctic and much more difficult to live in if you aren't have the generations and generations of learning how to survive in the Arctic like the indigenous of that area do. If you're just a Norse rolling up in a boat and it's your first time there, it's not going to go well for you.
I mean, this is the other thing, too, that there are generational indigenous living in the Arctic, which I think is amazing. But, few and far between, doing what they can do to survive. But this is why it's so ridiculous that people just show up there and they're like, we did it. And I'm like, yes. And now will you survive to get home to tell somebody you did?
Right. But Joy, I brought all my food. I bundled up. I'm good, right?
I brought a great ship. They did bring a great ship. Nella's going to get to that, but...
No. Well, so getting to I brought a great ship. So you find this search for the Northwest Passage, which was believed to be a faster way of reaching China. It takes off during the Elizabethan era. So, and that's where you get people, they're sailing up the New York Bay, they're sailing through the Chesapeake, they're trying to find that Northwest Passage, and they start looking further north. We know that Martin Frobisher sought the passage in 1576, but he was blocked by Baffin Island, which isn't, when you look at a map, it's not that far into what we consider the Arctic Ocean. Even Henry Hudson got in on the Arctic exploration, and I don't know if you knew this. I did not know this, and I was agog. Do you know how he died?
I do not.
So he was set adrift with his son and 7 loyal crewmates after a mutiny because his ship, the Discovery, was trapped in pack ice in Hudson Bay.
Oh, no.
Wow.
I missed that memo that's how Henry Hudson died by mutiny.
Really?
That's terrible. Well, I mean, is it terrible? I don't know if it's terrible. Was he I don't know.
I mean,
what did the other people do to deserve being on the boat with him?
Like the fact that we have a river named after somebody.
I'm more like, are you really going to sit here and tell me I died in this large body of water and you're going to name it after me? I feel a little
feels rude.
Hudson Bay. I was
vindictive.
set adrift by mutineers and you named the bay after me? I don't know how I feel about
feels
that.
Weird. Feels like a weird flex.
But anyway, so then we jump to after the Napoleonic Wars. Big jump, but hear me out. Britain, of course, wins the Napoleonic Wars, and now you've got this navy with all these young officers, men like Franklin, John Ross, William Edward Perry, and there's no way for them to seek advancement or promotion when there's not a war going on. And, we'd had the Napoleonic Wars. They got a little bit of another go at it during the War of 1812. But Britain had to figure out a way of justifying this upkeep of a large active navy. And, we know at this time, Britain definitely had plenty of colonialism and empire building to do. There was also, they were looking for something that had more pizzazz, like that had more like glory and honor associated with it. And that's where you get people like John Barrow, who was the second secretary to the Admiralty, really digging up this old interest in finding the Northwest Passage. John Barrow was quoted as saying, "The discovery of a Northwest Passage to India and China has always been considered as an object particularly British." And you do see this shift from, they're not really interested in it being an actual viable sea route to China. What they're interested in is the glory and honor of being the first to put it on a map.
Yeah.
And
I was going to ask that question earlier, but I was like, I'm sure that she's building to this. Because I was like, I know that this is the most basic of questions, but like, what's the point of the Northwest Passage? So I guess there it is, to have it.
Yeah, my favorite thing is, like, if it was a good passage for trade, in theory, you would have already discovered it, right? Like, someone would already be doing it.
I guess, but like, maybe no one else looked hard enough, Joy. Maybe no one else had a super awesome
It's just
ship.
that one Chinese guy who knows the way, and he's not telling you. So you guys gotta figure it out yourselves. You can't cheat off my test. It's so weird.
So that was the goal, get to China?
It was no longer the goal to get to China. It was just to map the Arctic and to find the Northwest Passage and to prove
to discover
it existed.
what was not discovered yet. Quote,
and you have to figure
unquote.
it's the ego and naval supremacy of British exploration being, we're the ones that'll get it done. Mm-hmm. Like that's where it really, comes into it. Like, and you had the Americans trying to do their own Arctic exploration at the same time, because they were like, oh, we can't let the British show us up. But we had our own problems. I
was going to say, curious to hear how
really
that
quite
went.
get our nonsense together to like beat them at their own game. But so before the Franklin expedition of 1845, we have that first wave of Arctic explorers. So you have, and these are just some names I'm going to throw at you, and they will come up in the show and in the book. You have John Ross, who is the uncle of James Clark Ross. There's John Franklin, there's William Edward Perry, and these guys are exploring the Arctic and the Antarctic between 1818 and the 1830s. These are people who are going into the Arctic, and they come back, and they're getting knighted for not dying, because their experiences were brutal. You had, their ships getting stuck in pack ice for an entire winter. These were guys realizing that it turns out you only have 2 months in summer at best to explore this region before you're stuck in pack ice. And even then, when you have this first wave of Arctic exploration, we were actually in a warming period where the Arctic, the winters were considered mild. By the time Franklin heads back out there in the 40s, then we have a very bad winter, and he just happened to time it with a very bad winter. They had no way of knowing this. But that early wave, for all that they suffered, they had it easier. And that's horrifying.
Easier, what temperatures are we talking?
You're aiming at negative 40s and 30s instead of negative 60s.
Oof. Okay. All right.
Stuff like that.
And also, the more the pack ice would freeze, in theory, you wouldn't be able to anticipate how fast it would freeze if you're dealing with those colder temperatures, right?
Yeah. I mean, then you have to really start having men who are trained, very often men who were whalers, who were experienced with polar ice. These ice masters who were on guard to watch out for, that ice, it's starting to close up, but we can get through it, versus turn back right now. That ice is going to crush us if we get stuck in it. Because the other thing you have to realize about pack ice, and this will come up again as we watch the show, but as it forms, these ice flows will flow down from the north, and then they start to come up against each other, and then they will connect, and then they become like plates, where the pressure of the oncoming ice and of its thickening as it gets colder will cause them to either pop up or sink down. So very often if you are a ship trapped in the ice, and this is before the icebreakers that we have now, and even then you don't want to really mess with pack ice like that, you would have instances of these ships, if you were lucky, getting pushed up 40 feet into the air. Or worse, the ice would crush the ship down and destroy the ship, and then you're stuck on the pack ice with all your supplies. And then you got to get to land before the ice breaks.
It's just nightmare, just sheer nightmare. I wish people could just see our faces of just like, okay, why?
And those were the guys who were doing this by ship. John Franklin was born in 1786. He had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and in the War of 1812. And in 1819, he's chosen to lead the Coppermine Expedition. This was an expedition by foot to map the northern shoreline of the American continent. He went with 19 men and 20, including himself. And by 1821, 11 of them had died.
Oh, boy.
And this was, again, an overland expedition. He was supposed to meet up with Perry's ships, but he never made it. Before he got back to England, the local Hudson Bay traders roasted him for his poor planning. They questioned his competence. He didn't really manage to hit his goals, which was reach Repulse Bay, rendezvous with the ships.
Not have half his crew die.
Yeah. He only, I think, mapped about a couple 100 miles of shoreline.
Sure.
But just did not hit the mark. And then the expedition was also haunted that there were 4 murders and someone was committing cannibalism.
What?
And the worst part is the guy that they executed for the cannibalism, we only have Franklin and Hood's words that it was that guy who was doing it.
Cannibalism for kicks? Why was this happening?
Well, because they were starving to death. So this was the expedition that got Franklin the moniker of the man who ate his boots, because they literally boiled their extra boots for the leather. Right. And they were also scraping lichen off of rocks, which just makes this gross, slimy stew thing that more fills your stomach than actually
But someone was just killing and eating other people.
Yeah. So
without those people agreeing to it? I guess that's my question.
So, for example, one of the guys who was killed, the guy claimed, he was cleaning his gun and it slipped and it shot him in the head by accident, which was impossible because this was a long rifle.
Yeah.
This is you don't even need forensics to look at this and be like, this man did not accidentally shoot himself in the head with his long rifle. And supposedly this guy who was hung for cannibalism, who was executed for this, was sneaking off in the night and hacking off bits of their meat, of the dead bodies, and eating it in the dead of night. And everyone was like, why is he not losing weight like the rest of us? Allegedly, this is what happens. Again, there's there almost became a little bit of a conspiracy theory of, that's what they want you to believe, that they caught and executed the guy who was doing it.
Right. And that it wasn't a group decision.
I really wanted to know whether he was killing and eating other people or whether the other people were already dead. Because I feel like there is a difference there. But yes.
Well, again, 4 murders.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, but trying to play him off like it was accidental death. Anyway.
Oh boy.
Anywho.
Luckily, by the time Franklin gets back to England, all that sort of gets brushed under the rug in favor of lauding him as a hero of unusual courage in the face of adversity. So Franklin, he publishes his memoirs. He marries his first wife. The same year he goes off on his second, more successful expedition, she dies. So that's 1825. When he gets back, he marries Jane Griffin, who is she's a bit of a very adventurous Victorian lady herself. She's traveled a lot. She has modern evangelical ideas about morality and stuff. We will get into evangelical Christianity of the Victorian age later.
Where did the because I'm sure the Industrial Revolution also had to have a hand in some of this also,
we're
right?
In the thick of it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just checking. Yeah. Continue.
We're getting into the age, Charles Dickens would be a very good friend of Jane.
Right.
of Lady Jane. So
I forgot about Charles Dickens. Yeah.
Oh, well, we will get to Charles Dickens.
I know.
I have a bone to grind with Charles Dickens over the Franklin expedition.
Just one?
Oh, well, it's a big one though. It's like
A femur.
It's like a brontosaurus-sized femur. So Franklin is knighted in 1829, and then he is appointed to Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, also now known as Tasmania, in 1837, because by the 1830s, there's sort of a cooling off of interest in Arctic exploration. There is a very, successful expedition that goes down to the Antarctic with Ross and Crozier, two names we'll get to, but there's just not as much interest in it for a period. So he is given this office appointment. And from the best I can find, he was the kind of lieutenant governor that went in and he was trying to make all these reforms about penal labor. Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land at that point, about 40% of all convicts sent to Australia were sent to Van Diemen's Land. And they were used in hard labor, in factories, in really appalling conditions. And it seems like he was very into reforming that. There's other stuff he did there, though. I'm just like, you swear jar. But regardless, his actions in Van Diemen's Land made him very unpopular, and he was recalled in 1843 in some disgrace. However, he does manage to get back to England just in time for Barrow, who is that Secretary of the Navy, to really wants to make that one last push to close the gap of the Northwest Passage. Because up to this point, we had been going at the Northwest Passage from both ends, through Alaska and through Baffin Island and up through Greenland. And they estimated there was less than 311 miles of unexplored Arctic coastline to go, and that they were hoping to find the connection between the two. So they had mapped everything out, and then there was just there was just a big giant, we don't know what the coastlines of the islands look like in between here.
And you can't have an empty space on a map.
No empty spaces. So at that point, and this was very much like a particular, bee in the bonnet of Second Secretary John Barrow. He wanted to finish what he had started a quarter century ago. The quote is, he feared that England, having opened the east and west doors, would be laughed at by all the world for having hesitated to cross the threshold.
That's what would happen.
Yeah, that's what would happen. You dropped the ball in the last quarter, England.
Yeah, that's what we're all going to talk about.
So, the 1845 expedition. Barrow didn't want Franklin because Franklin was 59 years old. He originally wanted James Clark Ross, who was the nephew of the other Ross, and he was he had just come off of an Antarctic expedition. He was up and coming. Everyone thought he would do it. And then he was like, actually, I just got married. And my wife is like, no more Arctic exploration. I don't want you to die. And I'm like, I got to listen to the wifey. So Franklin campaigns really, really hard to get
these women and their nerves.
I know. How dare they? Not wanting their husbands to die for king and glory.
Oh, man.
I know. So Franklin campaigns, he gets it. He is given two ships, the Terror and the Ebrus, and they are scheduled to leave England on the 19th of May, 1845. He has a crew of 24 officers and 110 men split between the two ships. And the expedition was last seen by Europeans on the 26th of July, 1845. When Captain Dannett of the whaler Prince of Wales encountered Terror and Ebrus moored to an iceberg in Lancaster Sound. And that's it. That's the last time they're seen by white people.
So, what's going on with the people who crew these ships?
So you have...
is it money? Is it fame? It's not fame.
100%
They're not
money.
becoming famous.
Oh, no,
it's money, right?
It's both. During wartime, you would capture ships and you get prizes off of it, right? And then you'd be able to, you might get really lucky and be comfortable for the rest of your sad life, if you'd done that. For these dangerous missions, to my understanding, the British Navy offered additional pay for hazard pay. And then they also to my understanding, like if you kind of fell off the map and no one really knew what they were, they'd keep paying out to your family if you were, until it was presumed you were dead. Like, the fundamental reality is the money was mostly really good for these, much better than just a normal naval ship. Because it was considered dangerous work, but it was also considered like you were doing it for the glory of England.
I mean, but I can see that would be a pretty sweet pot to be like, yes, but if you can send money to my family while I have to overwinter in the Arctic for like, 18 months or what have you, whatever they thought it would be.
Yeah. Meanwhile, if you're an officer, an expedition like this is your best way of getting promoted within the Navy.
Because it can make your career. Yeah.
Exactly. This was already a system where you really needed someone to pay for your commission onto a ship.
Right.
And then if you didn't have a ton of money or a ton of influence, then this was your best shot for not being a lieutenant the rest of your miserable life or a midshipman the rest of your life.
Right.
You couldn't really win glory in battle anymore, but you could win it by overwintering and starving yourself to death and almost dying of scurvy and making it back alive.
And those are just the highlights.
But that's where we're at. And that's where I'm going to leave it, because I think I'd rather unpack what we know and what we don't know about what happened to the Franklin expedition as we watch the show.
Okay.
But to me, it just really drives home because, why are we so obsessed? Or, me and other people like me are so obsessed with the Franklin expedition. I think this is a question I'm going to come back to as we explore it more and we watch the show and we dive into what makes it such a mystery to us. I think it's partially because of the Victorian obsession that happened over it because of Lady Franklin and her drive to push the public to try to find out what happened to her husband and the men. At first it began as an attempt at a rescue mission. And then as the years went on, it became expedition after expedition just to try to find out what happened to them. And in that push to save the Franklin expedition or just to find the remains, that completed the mapping of the Arctic on British maps. It accomplished what Barrow had set out to do all along.
Behind every man.
Yeah. And then I think for us, in modern times, like any historical disaster, it offers those tantalizing questions of, but how much were they doomed because of human error? How much were they doomed just because they were in a harsh environment? Could they have been saved if they had just done one or a few things differently? The fact that we know so little allows us to constantly re-examine it and come up with new theories. And with every new artifact that's found, every new oral story from the Inuit that is remembered and, shared once more, it becomes all the more tantalizing. And it has such a role in both British history and Canadian history and also Inuit history. And the Inuit side of it was overlooked for so long that now that it really has started to be taken seriously since the ships were rediscovered underwater. And I think you really see the shift in how people talk about it and the Franklin expedition in that before and after. And you see that shift of archaeologists and anthropologists being like, why have we ignored Inuit oral history for so long? And meanwhile, Inuit historians are like, yeah, riddle me that.
Answer the question. Wait, so it's okay if you want to say like too spoilery, just wait and find out. But does the show get into either of those two things? Like his wife afterwards and that 100%. Side?
It does. It does absolutely. I wouldn't say like so much after, but it does show us what's going on in England a little bit.
Yeah. And it shows sort of how she realized that like, no, actually we need to go look for them kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I personally would have preferred it to show more of her fight to try and get that conversation started. But we do see it start.
Okay, so that's part of it. And then what is the role of Inuit oral history in the show? Like, I assume that it's it's incorporated in
I'll say
that's
this,
where we get a lot of the knowledge.
I'm sure
or is
it's
it like
better.
Actually no, it was ignored?
I'm sure it's better than the book.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the book, I will say this. The book has a bibliography at the back. Like, Dan Simons, for all the choices he made, he did do a lot of research. And then he also made a lot of choices with that research. The role of Inuit oral history and it being ignored, it goes all the way back to the very first people trying to find Franklin's expedition and the subsequent explorations that happen afterwards. And you have examples of Dr. Ray, who could speak the Inuit language and who very purposefully said, hey, we have a better idea of what happened. I listened to some Inuit. And then people back in England, and I will get into this, being like, well, that was your first mistake. You listened to the natives, and they're obviously lying.
Okay.
The Inuit knowledge of what happened and the things that were witnessed was considered lies by white
and
people.
extremely
And
just
that's the reality of
dismissed.
it. Absolutely dismissed.
Yeah. So that's
and you
how it's
had,
played
and
in
you
the show,
had,
too.
You had Arctic explorers going in there who knew better, who did make record of what the Inuit had seen and believed them, and then they were discredited upon getting back to England. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So cool. I'm excited about those two aspects, weirdly.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I'm also excited to see what actually happens in this show and to find out more about the expedition and how the show paints what went down. But those two aspects also intrigue me.
Yes. Yeah. But that's, again, like, there's so much fascinating history about the Franklin expedition that happens after we know they were probably all died at that point. And everything that was able to be recovered and everything we know that was lost and that we can never recover. So it's a lot.
Yep.
It is a lot. And when the book was written, I mean, I just want to bring up this point while we're talking about, context and everything. When the book was written, neither ship had been found still as of 2007. And I think even the second ship hadn't been found when the show came out, right?
When they were filming it, they had found one ship but hadn't yet found the other, from my recollection.
Yeah, I think they found one but not the other. Like these ships were very recently found.
But Nella, were there like leftover like little tidbits, or did you have anything like? I don't know. I don't want to make any predictions. I feel like all my predictions are just going to be off. They're just completely out of left field and embarrassing.
I was trying to... You see, this reminds me of when I was in archaeology class once, I had a teacher use the Franklin expedition for an example of field work and of a discovery that was made, but he made the crucial error of teaching about the Franklin expedition, and I had just read that book, and I blurted out the surprise before he got to it, and I stole all of his thunder, and I did not mean to, but he was like tiptoeing around like the big reveal, and then I had the light bulb moment of like, wait, are you talking about the Franklin expedition where they discovered blah blah blah? And yeah, so I'm trying to avoid that. I'm trying to save the big reveals for when we get to them.
Like they're well constructed lesson plan, perfectly paced lesson, dashed to pieces.
Look, I'm just saying, he showed the ice mummies, and then my brain clicked, and I was like, this is the Franklin expedition! They excavated those!
I did recognize the ice mummies. Like, I remember seeing those pictures when I was a kid.
Yeah, because, once they excavated those, it was, all the National Geographic about, ice mummies, and,
Which are fascinating, by the way, listeners. If you ever want to just Google the ice mummies of the Franklin expedition,
and look, if you are squigged out by dead bodies, they are, they are very well preserved, so they can be incredibly unsettling. Listener beware. But I think they're incredibly fascinating. The fingernails and the hair and everything that is preserved. Even when they first excavated them, the eyes were still preserved.
See, what's so funny to me about those images is that I never found them. This is me personally, right? I never found them. I can't even think of what word it is. Not eerie or creepy or whatever, because they're so dried out. There isn't any gore.
They're just husks.
See, I don't even think they're that dried out, though. Like, to me, like, this is not like a... Like, to me, that, like, they're... I don't see them as dried out. It's not like, to me, like an Incan mummy, like those are dried out, but like.
But maybe, like, that's what I mean. Like, it's like, not dried out was the wrong word, but they're so well preserved. It's just like looking at a person's face.
Well, so maybe that is what I think what it is it's like the difference between actual mummification and like fossilized. Because I feel like those... Which, of course, talking to an archaeologist about this kind of thing, I can't wait for it to be like, you're both wrong. But like, but like that way in which, it's just like a very, all the skin is very well preserved and just like a very sallow death. And just like, they're just frozen. Like, they're just frozen in ice. And that's just it, It's fascinating. I mean, I guess while we're talking about like the actual dead bodies here in the setup episode, heads up for the show, it's not particularly gory, but it is horror. We do have some body horror that happens in the show. So if that is, an issue for you, just a heads up as you're watching it. It is available on Hulu. And actually, I'm sure there's probably a website here or there to let you know what trigger warnings you would need to see. If anything comes up while we're watching it, we'll do our best to put up something at the beginning of the episode about what we talk about. But generally speaking, it is a horror series, so prepare yourself for that.
Yeah, so, this season will be like PG-13-ish. Ish. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do instead of swear jar? We're going to have to think of something like
anchor.
Naval. Exactly.
I think swear jar is perfectly acceptable.
We could continue swear jar. Maybe we could donate to some kind of nautical school for.
I'd probably in some indigenous
organization
for like preserving language or something.
For sure. Actually, that would be great.
Idea. I like that idea. All right, is that it? Did we do it?
Yeah, and that's our setup. That's and then I'll see you again for the first episode where I will continue my extensive notes, but in further detail.
I'm so excited. I am. I really am. Mostly because here's the thing. So here's what I currently know about the show. This is what I'll end with. What do I currently know about the show? I know that it is based on the Franklin expedition. Okay. And yes. I know that it is scary. And that's literally it. Like, I don't know whether this is going to be a murder mystery and someone is killing a human is killing the people on the ship. I don't know if this is going to be a ghost story.
I'm so ready. I'm so ready.
No idea. I can't wait.
It's going to be so many twists and turns, and I'm going to have to bite my tongue in every episode and be like, just wait. This is going to be season 5 of Fringe. This is the season 5 Fringe revenge from Nella.
The only reason I think it's not going to be a ghost story is I think you two would have warned me if it were a ghost story.
True.
So I'm going to hazard.
Yeah, season 2 is the ghost story.
Season 2 is the ghost story. Yeah, listeners, like we all have our things. Danielle's not a huge fan of the ghost stories, particularly.
Don't like it.
I mean, particularly Asian ghost stories, which, to be real, is a lot.
I mean, like, particularly those, but also, like, when I saw The Sixth Sense when I was a kid, I had nightmares for, like, 3 weeks straight.
Yeah.
It's
scary.
Like, all that stuff, I'm like, no, thank you. So I'm going to go with it's probably not ghosts, but that's just based on my knowledge of you two.
True. No, we would have given you a heads up for that. But yeah, no, season 2 is the ghost story. We'll see if we get there, or if we take a break in the middle.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that covers it.
Yep. All right. I'm calling that. I just wanted like a one more thing.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you got your one more thing.
Would it really be binge o'clock if we didn't have a one more thing?
Really? I know. Exactly. We also have a question. And here it is. Okay, first, let's do the sign-off.
Yes.
Listeners, We would love to hear from you. Please check us out at Binge O'Clock Pod on Twitter and Facebook, where you can answer the question, how many days would you go without food before eating the person next to you? You can also email us at bingeoclockpod@gmail.com. And don't forget, we have a Patreon. Find us at patreon.com/clockpod.
That's right, and tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, tell the live lobsters in your life about Binge O'Clock, and we will see you next time.
You know, I can't believe you're making me answer the survival cannibalist question.
You don't have to answer it.
And we're going to get
Nella,
into it as the show goes on.
Nella, you do realize we don't always answer the questions. You just like to answer.
I always answer the question.
But Nella does.
Nella does. Nella answers the question.
I always answer the question.
Well, maybe the answer is you wouldn't eat the person next to you.
I mean, the answer is, like, if we're talking like they're already dead because they died in a crash in the mountains of the Andes.
Well, I was going to say, when it's like the kids in the mountains and they gave permission to each other.
Yeah.
Like,
versus,
I think that's different.
The Essex where we're killing people by straws. And I'm like, maybe that's not the way to go.
I probably would be the person to offer up. I would be like, where'd Joy go? Oh, she walked out onto the cold. And then there's just a note that's like, don't let this be for nothing, jerks. I
was going to say, I actually don't
my body.
I don't think that I would have to make this decision because there's no way I would survive for that.
I was just going to say,
I would be
that's the other thing.
First to go.
It depends on who I'm with and how well prepared we are, I think.
Look, all I hope is that should I ever be in the situation, something takes me out while I still have all my fat on me, because the fat is what's going to keep you guys alive, not the meat.
Right.
You need the fat. So hopefully, something, I don't know, maybe I fall and I break my neck, and then you're like, oh no, Nella.
Oh man.
Well, she's not getting any deader. Like, I allow it. I give you full permission. Just don't murder me for it.
That's all I ask.
Just don't murder me.
I feel like that's a good way to end the podcast.
That is a good way to
Just
end
don't
it.
murder me.